Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Quantic Conversations. I'm Kelsey Duggan, Quantic's Associate Director of Brand, and today's session will be focused on embracing your leadership journey with confidence and confronting imposter syndrome. This live is part of our Women Who Lead Week. All throughout the week, we'll be celebrating the incredible achievements and inspiring journeys of women leaders in our Quantic community and beyond, who have shattered glass ceilings and blazed trails across diverse business industries. So, now just to kick it off, a quick few housekeeping notes. Today's session will be about 45 minutes long and it's recorded. So, if you have to leave, know that you can always come back and kick things off right where you left off. Also, if you are interested in learning more about Quantic's MBA or Executive MBA, we will have a handy QR code at the upper left screen of this live throughout the entire conversation. Feel free to use that at any time to learn more about our student experience. And now, to everyone joining us, thank you and welcome. We want to make sure this is an engaging and interactive experience for you as well. So please let us know where you're joining from in the comments. We love to see that we have such a global audience, and it's always amazing to see where you all are joining from. We really appreciate it, and we love to see that. We'd also like to kick things off with a question. We've been asking our students, alumni, and faculty this question all week long, and we would also love to see you finish the sentence in the comments. So, the sentence is, when I think of the future of women in leadership, dot, dot, dot. So again, feel free to type your answers in the comments. There is no right or wrong answer. And again, that question is finish the sentence. When I think of the future in women in leadership, dot, dot, dot. All right. And so now I am thrilled to announce our moderator for today's live. Many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with her. She is Quantic's business reference librarian, Christina Batiste. Before joining Quantic, Christina was a content strategist and user experiencer researcher for the University of Southern California and taught in the Master of Management in Library and Information Science program at USC Marshall School of Business. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in English from Stanford University and her Master of Information in Library Science from the University of British Columbia. She also happens to be the host of our newly launched podcast, Quantic Catalyst. For this podcast, she sits down with Quantic alumni and they talk about what they do, how they do what they do, and the business lessons they've learned on the fly. So I'm telling you, definitely give that a check out on Spotify. It is 100% worth the listen. And so, without further ado, I'd like to kick things off. I'm going to now trade places with Christina. So, I'm going to welcome her to the screen. And yes, we will kick off this amazing conversation. See you all on the other side. Thanks, Christina.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christina. I'm your librarian, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm so excited to see everyone from all over the world. I'm so glad that people could make time for this. So I've been really looking forward to our Women Who Lead Week and to this talk in particular. I don't think I've ever met anyone who hasn't experienced imposter syndrome, myself included. And I'm hoping this discussion will help us pinpoint the problem and maybe get some different perspectives and identify some practical tools to address it when it pops up. I'm going to be talking today with Quantic alum Danielle DeCesaro. She's an associate product manager at Rapid Micro Biosystems, where she heads up a technology platform that automates the compendial method of quality control microbiology. Not being a microbiologist myself, I do not have any idea what that means, but she's going to tell us. I do know that she is not only committed to excellence in her own field, but to connecting women to opportunities wherever she can. It's why she's a perfect guest for our Women Who Lead Week. Another reason we really wanted to bring her in was her commitment to continuous learning and development. She's navigated some major career shifts over the last few years and earned her EMBA with Quantic in the middle of all that. So welcome, Danielle. Let's talk imposter syndrome.
Great. Thanks for having me, Christina. Yeah, let's talk about it.
Okay, well, first of all, before we get started, for those of us who aren't microbiologists or materials engineers, can you give us a really quick, like a 1-minute layperson's overview of what your role is and what kind of problems you and the team solve and what the makeup of your team is?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, to your point, microbiology, I did that for about 12 years, materials engineers, about 2 here at Rapid, and then I transitioned to product. So I was trying to think of the themes that connect them. And it really comes back to focusing on how things happen and what levers are available to change the outcome. And at the end of the day, it's really focusing on product quality, our end user. So the team that I work with is comprised of developers and engineers. The commercial side, right, is all aspects of the business, which is why I got into product management. I love that my day today is very, very different, where when I was a scientist, it was a little bit more consistent, although, experiments are just that. You don't really know how the outcome will be. So that's, 1 minute worth.
Okay.
And we can get into a little bit more details later.
Fantastic. So the other thing I want to do, just to frame our conversation for everyone, when we're talking about something that is a little bit fuzzy, something like imposter syndrome, there are different ways to think about it. So I'm curious about what imposter syndrome means to you, and how do you define imposter syndrome?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's important to at least have a consistent definition for how I'm framing it. So I love that question. If you Google it, I'm sure that there's a wide array of answers. I did Google it earlier just out of curiosity. For me, it is interesting. I think you nailed the term fuzzy right on the head. It is fuzzy. It is more of a feeling for me, and when I notice it. But it seems to be, the definition that I use is something where when it crops up and it's just sort of that voice, right, going, why is anyone listening to you on this, right? And it's not usually in a moment, it's usually after, but something will have happened and I'll be like, well, no one has any reason to pay attention to your thoughts and opinions. So that's how I define it, is that feeling. And it's maybe based in a little bit of anxiety in some cases for me, but at the end of the day, it's just, I don't feel like I belong. And so that's how I frame it.
You said a couple of really insightful things that I just want to call out. One is that you don't necessarily notice it in the moment, but sometimes after the fact, or after something happens, that can creep in and you can start to notice that more and more, and it can grow not just in the meeting or in that room, but later on. And I think that's a really important part of imposter syndrome, or when we're talking about it, that it is not something that you can call out and say, I'm seeing this, and everyone stop this, and let's fix this right now, because it happens after. It happens at 3 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep because you're thinking about this thing. And
Exactly.
I think that's a really important component of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So is there maybe a time in your career back when you were a scientist, maybe, or working as a materials engineer, or even now as a product manager, that you can recall a season in that time that you identified that? And what I want to know is what helped you identify that that's what you were feeling, that it wasn't necessarily legitimate questions of your competence, but more of that imposter syndrome. And how did you figure that out? Did you have people around you that helped you understand what you were going through, or sounding boards? What were some of the clues for you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll give a specific recent example in a minute, but it's funny. I was talking to my husband last night about this conversation and being excited for it, and of course, some of the, wow, I can't believe that they're having me talk about that, right? So there you go. It's right there, right? But he actually gave a short anecdote that I just like to reference, and then we'll talk about the my own personal events. He reminded me that there's a story, and I'll shorten it, but Neil Gaiman, who's an author, right? Pretty well accomplished. He had been invited to an event, and there were many incredible people there. And he struck up a conversation with someone. And that person said, I look at these people and think, what am I doing here? They've made amazing things. I just went where I was sent. And that person was Buzz Aldrin, right? And so I bring that up because the word just is part of my answer, right? His use of the word, I just went, that's the clue, right? That usually is me saying, or I'll hear someone else say it, or someone will say to me, oh, stop diminishing your, performance. And it's not intentional, right? I'm trying to say, here's what I did. And the word just ends up being part of that sentence. And so a recent example I do have, and I think you called it out really well. How do I identify it? Usually after the fact. And we'll talk about this, I think, a bit more later too, is really important. I think a lot of people have heard the term personal board of directors, right? We talk about mentors, sponsors, coaches. They're all important. But there is another element. And while I've never really made it official, in fact, if you ask the people who I consider on mine, they probably wouldn't call it that, right? Where it's just a dialogue that we have. But I was having a conversation with someone on this personal board of directors, and I had asked them a question because I was trying to figure out long term what I was interested in and just trying to get a sense for, I know what I like to do, but understanding how I'm perceived by others, because it is difficult when you don't necessarily believe yourself, or don't necessarily want to, because if imposter syndrome's creeping in, right, you're like, oh, I'm so bad at that, when you're not. So I was having this conversation, and the answers to my question, they were incredibly supportive, right, and great. And so it was that first frame of the helpful context. But then the next person who's also on this board is a very kind person, but also calls me on my stuff, when it's appropriate. And so they gave me some feedback on the scenario, and it was really, hey, think of if you were dealing with yourself, right? If you were sitting in that meeting listening to how you ran it, right? What would you tell that person? And so getting that feedback from someone who is applauding me, they're in my corner, but they're also saying, hey, this isn't a victim mentality. This is how would you mentor this person? How would you mentor yourself? And so really just having someone to cheer you on, but also having someone to keep it real while still cheering you on, and give you useful feedback on how you could have done something differently, right? Because we can always improve. I think sounding boards are incredibly important. I encounter this, if not daily, weekly. It's gotten better, right? As a scientist, there were many more stories of it because I just felt I was working my way up. I didn't necessarily deserve to be in the room. Nowadays, I'm usually the one running the meeting, but still can have those types of feelings. So I'd say it's just, see, there's that word again. It's about, I told you it was going to come up.
It is
It's about noticing it in myself and catching those things, but also making sure that you have your support system, someone that you can play the scenario to, and they will be fair and also give you that feedback, because it's great to hear positive things, but those positive things don't necessarily help you when you start to swirl down the I don't belong path. So
I love that. We call the just word, that's the J word in my house, in our house. So I totally agree with that one. But I want to get into a little bit about your personal board of directors and the sounding board that you have. And if you said that it's not a formal thing, but I feel like that's one of the specific and more practical tools that people might be able to take away from something like this. Are those organic relationships? Do those start off as a mentor relationship, or any of those former managers? Or how did you build that? And how do you think of doing that?
Yeah, there's a lot of advice on forming it and making it more concrete, having an email that you send out to have a accountability session in terms of that way, right? You give a status report via email. For me, the folks are direct peers that we were friends and just, again, gave that feedback, right? I know that they will tell me the truth, but also, will be kind. They don't intend to hurt my feelings, but direct. There is one previous supervisor on that, and then one person who I would say is sort of a matrix view, right? They were above me in an organization, and we had formed sort of a coaching relationship. But again, nothing truly formal, which for me, I like that type of building organically, right? It's sort of the, hey, we're going to catch up, have some coffee, talk about life, and then, oh, hey, this happened at work the other day, and I'm curious how I could have handled it differently. And it helps that some of these people know me very well, have seen me as I've developed through a lot of career changes. And so that type of relationship where they know where I've come from, and can help frame the advice. It is a very useful tool. And I think forming one, it will be different for everybody. For me, it's organic. Others might need more structure.
Okay. And one final question on this. And by the way, for people who are listening or watching, you can type, if you have questions for us, you can type them in the comments and we'll try and get to some of those at the end. So if there's anything that we're talking about that you want to ask more about or get more into, put it in the comments and hopefully we'll have time to get to some of those. Last question on this, and this is again a more practical bent here, but how often would you say that you are reaching out to some of the people on your board of directors? Is that something that's happening weekly, monthly, quarterly? What kind of frequency are we talking about?
Yeah, no, it's a helpful question. So again, it's more organic, but what I will say is there's folks that I would consider on this that I reach out maybe quarterly or even, annually, just
Okay.
send a quick note on LinkedIn or an email, say, hey, how's it going? Here's what I'm up to, right? And it's just, that's a practical networking tip. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just catching up with that person and hopefully they respond back, and they usually do. And then with the more practical nuance, sort of, I need to call somebody because I can tell that I'm about to sort of lose my confidence. Those folks are more on a weekly basis. And again, it's really just reaching out via a quick text or something. One person I send memes to, and so there's sometimes a joking meme that the other person can tell that there's something to talk about.
That's not just a meme.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a few who are more like on a monthly thing, and again, it's more of a check-in, see how they're doing, because they have their own life and their own things that maybe they need a sounding board on. So it's regular and consistent in terms of just knowing which switch to pull depending on the scenario.
That's great advice. Thank you for that. So one thing you just mentioned is something that, like, some of those triggers that might spark these feelings of imposter syndrome, either in your career, in your background, or people you've seen, maybe people on your sounding board or people whose sounding board that you're on. Some obvious ones might be a career transition or a change or personal life change. You can tell us about how shifting to hybrid kindergarten for you and your family may have changed some things for you. And so what are your thoughts on how a big either professional or life shift can impact your sense of self or confidence?
Sure. Yeah. No, it's great. I laugh because we all went through a shift during COVID, I'm sure to varying degrees. My son was starting kindergarten, and so we were faced with, he could either go completely remote, and he's in kindergarten, doesn't check his email, right?
Kindergartners have emails now?
He did not have email, but he did that year. So then we went hybrid. So he would at least get some interaction while being safe. But I was still going to the office, right? So that was a challenging perspective. And one, I had to learn to ask for help, which is not an easy thing for me to do. But also just managing, when their homework or their work for that day is in an email that they don't check because they can't read yet. And my husband, who was caring for our 1-year-old at the time, right? So again, I'm in office, still in office. Our son is starting, 2 days a week in person, the other 3 on a computer. We have a 1-year-old, and he's home caring for all of this, trying to make sure that our child logs into the correct Zoom meeting at the right time. So, but things like that, right? Like, I do usually come out of those with, wow, I got that done, right? It is a confidence boost because you have to, right? One way or another, it has to get done. It has to happen. And so I tend to find confidence boosting comes from those events. Obviously, no one wants so many crazy circumstances at a time, but they happen. So those are useful in that they boost me. Professionally is interesting when, I've had some changes in terms of my career, chosen career path, went from very technical to a commercial facing role, and I'm still learning that. Those ones are interesting because you get that boost, right? When you get hired or moved to that role. But what is interesting is I find that it kind of fades quicker, right? It's sort of like, oh, cool. Yeah. And then all the doubts creep in. Like, I've never done this before. How do I do this? And it's those times, I think, where the confidence that you build in other aspects can be a good reminder. And again, consulting that board of directors, and they can sort of call you on your stuff and say, you handled all of these things. Like, of course you're going to do great at this, right? So.
Well, that was excellent. And another thing that I think that we don't talk about enough is oftentimes, as you mentioned, these challenges can give you confidence in the after. When you're looking back at them, you feel confidence. One of the things I don't think we acknowledge often enough is that when you're in the middle of that, that can feel really hard. That it's a lot. It's not always, you're not always looking in the rearview mirror. Sometimes when you are going through that, that can be a really, really challenging thing. And that might lead to another one of those, that strategy of really being able to reach out to someone. And I think that's why it's so important that you mentioned that these are people that you've known and that you trust, because making yourself vulnerable in that way and saying, I am having a really hard time right now, and I'm not feeling confident at work. I'm not feeling like I can do this. When you look back on it, you think, oh yeah, I did that. I was able to overcome that. But in the middle of it, it's really hard.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that to share with people?
Yeah, I mean, in the spirit of being, open and vulnerable, I also have a therapist, right? I see a therapist. It's important for mental health. And I'm thankful that I found one before COVID because, I had 2 sons and, that was when I started therapy. But that's also another aspect, right? So stressing the importance of mental health and finding those mechanisms, just that they have tips, whether it be breathing exercises, to just reground yourself, or the one that works for me. In fact, I'm nervous, so I'm literally holding like a little fidget toy right now, is holding something, right? And just keeping yourself present in the moment. And I'm fiddling with something because I need to move my hands, right? So I think that in addition to the people who know me really well, right, is okay to see a therapist or a coach, right? People are very good at sort of also removing themselves from a situation. So the personal connections are great, but they do come with their own baggage. So it's also important to have a more neutral party that you can talk to and just say, here's where I'm at. Here's the advice I've gotten. Here's what I've tried. Do you have anything else I can try? Right? Because not everything works. Breathing exercises do not work for me. So I've had to find other things that do. But yeah, but that's just, it's another mechanism, because you're right. It's hard. And even after the fact, for some of the events, I still look back and go, yeah, I didn't build confidence from that one. I'm just glad I made it through. Right.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. So another trigger, we had a question from the audience. What seems to be some of the factors that lead to imposter syndrome? And another one that's pretty common is comparison. So I want to talk about that a little bit. We live in this Instagram world where we are hardwired to compare ourselves to other people. And sometimes that can be useful when you're looking at someone whose career you may want to emulate or someone you admire. That can be a really good thing to help you identify some paths that you might want to take. It can also be a big component for contributing to imposter syndrome, because those comparisons you never have the full picture. You never know what's really going on.
Yeah.
Any insights on how to recognize when comparison or when looking at your peers or people you admire is helpful and when it might not be so helpful, or anything you've seen or used that might be useful in that context?
Yeah, I don't know if I've just been lucky, but in terms of social media itself, I'm on all of them. I don't particularly use them or use them well. So, brand ambassador that's social media driven might not be a good career swap for me in the future, because I know just enough to be dangerous, right? Like, I'm an elder millennial. I grew up with Facebook. Instagram's there. I'm kind of on it. But, one of the things that has been useful is every now and again, I do head on the, Instagram or TikTok and see all these people doing these amazing things. And what I found to be really helpful were some of the influencers who are mindful that, what they're doing and how they make their, living, which is wonderful, can give people that comparison deficit and bad feelings. And so there's actually a few accounts where they show what the actual picture looked like before touching up, or the same day, different angles. And it's just a little bit to realize, because we all know that there's extra there, right? But having the real side by side so you can see that, oh, this is how beautiful that came out to be, but there was a lot of work that went into it, right? Whether it be intentionality with the lighting or some makeup or some post-production. So those have been really helpful just to remind, right, that there are accounts that show. But to your point, though, too, comparison is great to see what people are capable of, right? But also reminding yourself, like I think my trick, why I don't usually fall down that rabbit hole in particular is, you never know what someone has for their support system, right? So
Very good point.
I've seen amazing people, right? Like there's always that, like, young girl or boy, who's still in high school, who started their own company, and looking back and seeing, I'm so happy for them that they had some support, right? Whether it be financial from their parents, or maybe they have someone who's very business minded in their life that was able to give them the advice to help them succeed, right? So just acknowledging that, where I've come from, while very privileged, is different than where others come from, and sort of keeping that in mind, because it's your work, but it's also how you were, the resources you had accessible to you.
That is so important. And I love the analogy of what you said about the before, after, or showing, here's the shot I'm posting on Instagram. Here's what else was happening all around that. And you're right, you don't see that. Translating that visual one into, this is what the makeup and lighting and everything looks like, into your professional life. And this, this manager or this leader looks like that's the zoom in shot of them,
they got it.
just winning. And you don't see that there's a personal assistant, and there's this, and they took this thing off their plate, and they had somebody else do this project, or all of the things around that zoomed in shot of that leader that you don't really see. And I think that being able to remember, I love that as a memory trick of saying, hey, this is not showing me the same angle, or I'm not seeing all of the behind the scenes stuff that is going into that. I like that. I think it's a really good strategy for doing that. Let's talk about more strategies. Are there any other things you've found that you can consciously do to help with that? Any techniques? I love that, breathing, nothing is going to work for everyone. Breathing techniques might not work for you. Are there any phrases that you found helpful? And what I'm thinking about is, we already identified that imposter syndrome isn't something that you may be feeling that a little bit in the meeting, but you really felt it a lot before the meeting, when you're trying to prepare for the meeting and get geared up for it. And then after the meeting, when you're reviewing everything that you've said and thinking about all these little things that you did and waking up in the middle of the night. Are there any strategies that have really worked for you, in addition to what you've already shared with us?
Yeah, I think it just, again, comes back to, and it's hard because you can't just say, oh, well, be more confident, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just silly.
Just be more confident.
So some things that have been useful that I've started to do, and again, it's a practice, right? It's sort of like forming the habit and getting good at it. Keeping your own, I think it was a podcast, Career Contest, I listened to, where she talked about keeping your own sort of brag book, right? For whatever it is. It can be useful for performance reviews, but it can also be, I wrote an article on this, or I, got through this meeting that was really, this was be all end all. We got through it on time, right? Whatever those things are that you'd either like to remember, just having it there. And, it's sort of like building your portfolio. I know some artists and writers, and portfolios are really important because it can show people, that you are what you say you are before they pay you for, whatever work that you're being requested to do. Well, it can be similar for me, right? So I do have like a running list, and I've done a webinar before, and I'm going to add this to this list, right? So having those items that you can look back at, and in a quick to access spot too. So I do have it right on my desktop. And if I am feeling, bad and just need sort of some type of boost and I can't get to my network, I usually pull that up and just remind myself, hey, you've done these things. Like maybe it didn't go exactly how you wanted it to go, but that doesn't mean you didn't belong there. So just
that is an excellent tip for anyone who's listening to that. I think that is absolutely genius to have a Google Doc or something that you can put in there of those things that you've done, or those meetings that you've led successfully, or or even conversations that happened with something that was intimidating to you. If you had to have an intimidating conversation, writing that down and saying, hey, I did this, and this was the outcome of that, to help remind you of some of the things that you are capable of, I think is an excellent, excellent strategy. I want to talk about that we talked a lot about looking back at things that build confidence, and I want to talk about the forward-looking side of that too. Do you have any ways of thinking about goals for your future, or things that you want to accomplish or you want to get better at, that are part of your toolkit in combating imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to learning. I think you brought up in my intro, I really enjoy learning,
Mhm.
to the point where, folks I work with who saw me make the decision to get my degree, with Quantic, are just waiting until I pick a new thing to go and learn. It's just I really enjoy learning, right? And sometimes I realize that I've learned something and I have no interest in doing it again, like accounting, which I found out through Quantic.
We won't tell our accounting faculty that you said that. We'll hide that.
They already know. But it's really just, I do listen to a lot of podcasts, I read books, and those are sort of my strategies in terms of thinking about it. And then I mentioned it earlier with the board of directors that I use, but one of the things was, I'm trying to remember her name. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. Christina Wallace. She did a podcast on building a portfolio career, and that's where those questions came from, right? About being mindful of what I enjoy doing and what other people see me like. One of the questions is, when have you seen me happiest, right? And so using that to identify, there's endless places I could go and learn about and do, but in terms of setting goals and focusing, it can be really challenging when it's just, keep going, right? And you're not sure what to do next.
Yes.
So that's been my strategy as of late, is say, okay, I'm learning still, I'm comfortable, I'm good, but where to go next, I don't know. Maybe let's look at what I enjoy doing and what people come to me for, and when I look happiest, because those are the items that might help me connect. Oh, I really like mentoring. Maybe I should look into mentoring more, or maybe I should look into becoming a people manager, right? Rather than leading through influence. So that's sort of how I set the next steps for looking forward. And again, building those skills, so then I'm confident, at least in my ability to know the words that are being said to some degree, and I don't feel, not confident or like an imposter.
That in particular, I want to dig into more about what makes you happy, or what kinds of things people come to you. I think that's a really good tactic. But you also mentioned vocabulary. Just understanding the terms that are going around is a huge thing in feeling more confident in whatever space you're in, especially if you're going into a new space, like you did, moving into the business side of what you were doing.
Yeah.
Was there anything that really helped with that for you, with learning that vocabulary, or being more comfortable just talking about some of the issues that started to come up in work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say, going for my EMBA with Quantic, I did when I was still an engineer, and was like, I applied for the program. It was kind of on a whim, one evening in November for my cohort, and I didn't have any specific interest of going to the business side, but I had gained exposure in my role to cost initiatives. And so it was really realizing that there's more to why we make certain decisions, even when the technical side, the answer seems very clear. And so then, going for that, I still might not be the best at calculating, ROI or certain things on the accounting book. But just knowing that I've heard the word and I know where to look for more details if I'm not confident in how to express in that terminology. And I mean, heck, that goes for what I do today too. So it's not just the business change from technical, but then I also work with software, and that's also a very different technical skill than where I come from, right? So having that vocabulary and knowing that when the team says a certain word, my first instinct might be to go back to my microbiology days or to the commercial days, and that's not the right definition to interact with that team. And so, yeah, words and at least knowing the different contexts words can have matter. And so, yeah, I mean, learning about them and through the program was fantastic because I at least know where to look, right? I can go back to my coursework or I can Google something a little bit better to help define it so I can speak more comfortably on it.
Yeah, well, as a librarian, I love that. Access to information or understanding where to find it is almost as important as having it yourself.
Yeah.
So being able to know where to go, I think is a really good strategy. Also, just building that competence, that the imposter, the person who feels like an imposter feels like they don't have that level of competence in order to be in that room or do that work. And so attaining that level of competence is a really good weapon in fighting imposter syndrome. It's a really
Absolutely.
good way to do that. You have mentioned a couple of ways that you are fighting incompetence with competence. Some podcasts, books, getting your EMBA, continuous learning. Are there any resources that you would recommend to people just, about being in the business world, being in STEM, that you think other people might really benefit from hearing or reading that you love?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I listen to nonstop podcasts usually when I'm on my morning walk. Brene Brown is great. Her series Dare to Lead, Adam Grant, Simon Sinek. I've mentioned the Career Contessa a few times. I don't know how popular that one is, but it's got some really great gems. From a product management side, there's Lenny's podcast where he interviews just amazing people from all these different companies. And what's cool about that too is it gives you, it's not always just one aspect, right? You get to hear from people about things that you might not expect when you think you're hearing from a CFO, right? They might be talking about something more technical or maybe a marketing decision they had to make. And so that's been really useful. And then just reading, I like to still read scientific papers and things and keep up to date because it's just really inspiring to hear what is now possible that wasn't before. So, yeah.
Those are great. Okay, so we've only got a few minutes. I've got one hard question and one easy question left.
Okay.
So my hard question is, if you could offer one piece of advice to women who are in leadership roles right now and who might be struggling, they might be in the hard part right now and not in the looking back and thinking, oh, I overcame that. I'm such a, strong woman in doing this. They're in the, I feel horrible right now and I can't, it's really hard to be here. What is your advice?
Yeah, no, it's great. I'll say knowledge is important, like we've talked about, and having the information, at least so you're aware, will help you make a decision, and that in turn will increase your confidence over time, right? But it can be challenging to have the information you might feel you need if you're not privy to, if you're not sitting at the table, or to quote the musical Hamilton, if you're not in the room where it happens, right? So one of the things is that I suggest is take any opportunity you're given, even if you are uncomfortable. If someone invites you to the table, even if you don't think you belong, go and have something in your pocket that, a goal. I'm going to contribute to this by discussing or asking one clarifying question so I understand this better when I leave here. And I'll just leave this advice with a quote that I heard at a recent networking breakfast by Vilma Martinez Dominguez. And I love it. She says, if you're not at the table, you're part of the meal. And that really, yeah, it hits, right? And it's because there's times where maybe you'll be invited to the table, but because you don't know why you're there and you're having all these struggles, right? You'll get in your own head, but you need to be there. And so look for opportunities to be there, speak up, and just listen, because people say really interesting things, and that in turn will help you, one way or another.
Yeah. That is excellent. I love that quote. I think it's great. If you're not at the table, you're on the table. But that is one really good thing you just said that I want people to remember is that having a goal for something like that. So if you're part of an initiative, if you're part of a meeting that you maybe don't feel like you belong at, or you feel like, why did they ask me here? Having that goal of, I'm going to ask one clarifying question, or I am going to try and amplify some other woman's voice while we're in that room. And I don't have to bring anything of my own. I can just amplify someone else. I can ask this clarifying question. I can summarize what happened at the end and make sure that we're all on the same page. Having a specific goal for some of these interactions or for some of these ongoing meetings, because this is not, an imposter syndrome is not a one meeting thing. It is not a one conversation thing. It is a 6-week project. It is a 3-year project that you have to keep coming back to and going into. And I really think that was a good bit of strategy of having something concrete, specific, and defined that you were going to do to help yourself feel more comfortable and feel like you belong. I think that's
great. And
great.
Thank you for bringing up the amplify, because that's absolutely right. It doesn't need to even be about yourself. It's an opportunity to amplify someone else's voice who may not have been invited to the table that day.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Okay, so our last question is a fun one. I love that in your bio, you are a self-proclaimed nerd and an early technology adopter. So tell us about, is there any kind of gadget or technology or skill that you picked up in the past, maybe as a child, maybe in college, that stands out as something that led you to STEM?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I had a reputation in my household for, anything that was coming out in technology I wanted, and most of the time we could not afford it. So those were just desired, items. But one thing was, I was very lucky, again, elder millennial. So we had a home PC and I played games on it. But one of the rules was I had to do Mario Teaches Typing for an hour every day. Did not like it at the time, but I'm thankful for the discipline, because I type very quickly, which is very useful, as you can imagine, both in terms of science and writing things up, as well as commercial, right? I can get thoughts to paper. I also take notes live. It's kind of annoying, but it's useful. And so that was a useful skill that I picked up early in childhood. And nowadays it's actually, science that I just always geeked out about. I like to see when you can use a technology to help raise an older thing, right? Like when you can put a little camera on a microscope. So now you don't have to like draw the picture of the bacteria. You can take a picture of the bacteria. Like that was huge. And that happened during my lifetime. In the workplace. And then the last thing I will say is ChatGPT, guys, like use it, learn how to prompt it, because that is that's what I'm geeking out about these days. Even if you know how to do something like in Excel using XLOOKUP, right? I can sit there and fuddle with it. Or I can ask ChatGPT and be specific, and it will literally give it to you, which is wonderful because it helps save some time. And also that's now like the new skill set, I think, right? How to prompt it to help take some of those items off your plate. So
that's a great one. That is really good. I was going to ask, what are you super excited about? What technology are you super excited about? It sounds like you're excited about AI, large language learning models. And
I think they're phenomenal, and not being afraid of them, just learning how to use them is really key. Because again, it's not going to write an amazing novel that's going to get published for you. You have to still, do the editing, do the work, but what you can feed it and then just see what it comes up with is fantastic. So big fan.
Cool. I love it. Okay, well, we are at, and I don't know if Kelsey's hopping back in here. We're at 45 minutes. I'm going to go and look at the comments and see if anyone has a question. Now is your chance. Type something in, ask us something that you might want to hear us talk a little bit more about, or have another question. We will address it. Let's see. Oh, I have someone just asking a kind of specific one. What is Lens Podcast?
Oh, Lenny's, Lenny. I think his last name is Rudzinski, but Lenny's podcast, and he does a newsletter. It's all about product, and it's on Spotify, probably other places you get podcasts. They're very good episodes, well worth listening to.
Okay. Well, okay, everyone. I don't see any other. Well, there may be one. Let me go scroll down. Okay. I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much for your time. This was fascinating. I feel like I learned quite a bit about you, and I love that. I love meeting new people and understanding more about what makes them work. So thank you for your time and your honesty and your words. For everyone who's watching, hope you enjoyed that conversation and have a great Women Who Lead week.
Thanks so much, Christina.
You're welcome. Okay. Bye, everyone.